Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when and where you're watching this video today. We're now arriving at the seventh lecture, which is focused on the topic of the rise of monasticism. We've been covering the last 2 weeks the church's transition from a position of persecution and fairly significant uncertainty about itself and struggle to live the life of a disciple of Christ to a change which would see the church gain new influence, new power, and relative comfort. Last week we looked at some of the ways that this shift that came as a result of the new relationship with the empire affected the church in terms of the wealth that it had access to, certain moral standards, enculturation with the wider Roman culture and the back and forth that happened there, relationships with the civil authorities and positions in civil authority. And we noted some of the ways that this was positive and certain good things that came as a result, and also some of the temptations and the challenges that it created for Christians. Today, we're looking at what is commonly seen as really a reaction to all of this, one of the more extreme negative reactions to the church's newfound position and status and influence in the world. And that's the increasing popularity of various forms of asceticism, of the denial of self and the body, and the withdrawal from the comforts of this world. Ultimately, the movement that we refer to today as monasticism, or the vowed religious life of men and women. Typically, studying this takes us to the Egyptian desert, where we begin to see some significant concentrations both of solitary monks, hermits, as well as communities of people coming together. All of these people in some way withdrawing from the wider society, from the wider church, happening to a growing degree in the mid-4th century, just a few decades after Constantine, and into the 5th century. And in your reading, Gonzalez, he certainly will frame it along these lines as a reaction that happens in the 4th century. And that's, I think, correct to a significant degree. But it's not as though the monastic idea, impulses towards that form of Christian discipleship, are something that just pop up out of nowhere, are brand new just in the 4th century because of Constantine. There are anticipations and seeds of the monastic principle in the Christian tradition that go back much before that. And so I want to begin today by paying attention to some of those earlier monastic precursors and things that influence and predate the 4th and 5th century era, where the monastic tradition begins to be more significant in early church history. The quote that I want to read to begin our time this week, it comes from a paraphrase from St. Augustine's great personal book, autobiography, memoir, The Confessions. And it's from book 8 of the Confessions, and this is where he's beginning to tell of his gradual conversion to Christ and some of the various people and events that played a part in that. And you'll hear in this story that it has a connection to the monastic movement. Augustine writes this: "One day there came to see me and Alpius a certain man named Pontitianus, our countryman from North Africa, and a person in a high office in the emperor's court. We sat down to talk, and he happened to observe a book on the table next to us. He took it, opened it, and was surprised to find that it was the writings of the Apostle Paul. He had thought it was one of the books that I was using for my teaching. He smiled, looked at me, and expressed his joy that I was reading this book, for he was a Christian and baptized, and often bowed himself before God in the church in frequent and continued prayers. When I told him that I had been struggling for some time to understand these scriptures, a conversation arose, suggested by his account, about Anthony, the Egyptian monk, whose name was up to that moment totally unknown to us. He continued to tell us stories about him, amazed that we did not know anything of such a great and holy man. We stood amazed, listening to all the wonderful works God had done in and through him, and about how all these things had happened so close to us, and in such recent times.